Hello everyone. Before we start today's video, if you could all do me a solid and lightly tap the like button, perhaps share the video about and leave a comment. If you are not subscribed, subscribe as well. It would greatly help this channel. Thank you very much. Hello everyone, welcome back to a Megon 2 Electric Boogaloo. Today I'd like to talk about Munroe Bergdorf, because Munroe Bergdorf is back in the news, and this in turn affords us, the lovely peasantry, the opportunity to look at who Munroe Bergdorf really is. Back in August of 2017, at the ripe old age of 29, Munroe was hired by L'Oreal, being the first transgender model to front a campaign for them. Munroe, though, attracted more attention following an article in the Daily Mail that highlighted Facebook comments that she, a mixed-race trans woman of English, white and black Jamaican heritage, had made about white people. The comments included lovely remarks of all white people were guilty of racial violence and that the white race was the most violent and oppressive force of nature on Earth. This in turn generated accusations that she was racist against white people. This did lead, much like other incidents, to the term reverse racism, which was a way of saying, when it's white people on the receiving end, that is reverse racism. The counter to that then would become, but structures of power, we must tear down the blah blah walls and blah blah structures in society and rebuild it anew on top of the ashes of the skulls of the dead. Or just simply, breed the white people out of existence, which wouldn't work anyway. I don't think people understand how skin color works. I could be wrong though. In response to these comments, L'Oreal fired her from its campaign. Facebook removed her posts from their website because they regarded them as a contravention to its rules against hate speech. I do not agree with hate speech rules. Don't try me. Munroe, in turn, said that she had faced online harassment, much of it racist and transphobic in nature. Many commentators had argued that the Daily Mail had quoted her out of context, and that her wider point about white supremacy and white privilege in Western societies was valid and needed wider dissemination. The problem many have is when you talk about white supremacy and white privilege, it is used by the majority of those who rail against white people in a Western society where white people make up a vast number of people as just an excuse to bully them, which doesn't allow for any intellectual discourse, because people will just use the buzzwords and dismiss you if you yourself, those that might say, can we perhaps stop for a minute, are white. Maybe even suggest one calms their tits and has a biscuit. Or maybe just stops because you are solely looking not to have an intellectual discussion, but to blame everyone for problems in your life that are mostly your fault. Any excuse after all, am I right? I fully expect that dislike to be smashed now. I couldn't care less. The full Facebook post, and I'm going to read it so you have the context. Honestly, I don't have energy to talk about the racial violence of white people anymore. Yes, all white people. Because most of y'all don't even realize or refuse to acknowledge that your existence, privilege and success as a race is built on the backs, blood and death of people of color. Your entire existence is drenched in racism, from microaggressions to terrorism. You guys built the blueprint for this. Come see me when you realize that racism isn't learned, it's inherited, and consciously or unconsciously passed down through privilege. Once white people begin to admit that their race is the most violent and oppressive force of nature on Earth, then we can talk. Until then, stay acting shocked about how the world continues to say something with an F in it, at the hands of your ancestors, and your heads will remain buried in the sand with hands over your ears. Well, now you have the context. Other remarks are absolute bollocks, right? Following the dismissal, Munroe went on to a TV show called Good Morning Britain. She then had an argument with Piers Morgan, who disagreed with a number of her views. He claimed to be offended by her suggestion that he as a white man was racist or sexist. What fascinated me was others ignored the points that she was making and the optics consequences of that, and instead latched on to whether or not this was a free speech argument. It's not a free speech argument at all. Companies don't want to be seen associating with people who say things like this. It's called a consequence. You still have your right to free speech. Platforms may not agree with you when they realize they well could get flack for it. And by the way, 3 years later, L'Oreal rehired her because she's a champion for freedom of speech. And of course, the trans community. She is their, apparently, avatar, akin to that of Keffels, with the minor exception being if you disagree with Keffels in the slightest, she'll get you banned off every single platform known to exist because she's totally not a bully. Munroe Bergdorf was trending on Twitter because Munroe had given an interview to Metro, a UK tabloid, the title being Munroe Bergdorf on transphobic TV debates. We are in this very precarious time. Munroe Bergdorf has opened up on it being a precarious moment in time for the trans community as she addressed the constant TV debates about trans people, being quoted as saying, "It hasn't been an easy ride for me. I think we're in this very precarious moment in time when it comes to trans rights. And I think that it's very reminiscent of where gay men were in the 1980s and 90s. With this mass hysteria over at the time, it was gay men, now it's trans people. Like, what does it mean if we have equal rights? Should we be allowed in the spaces we want to be in? All these things are being debated about trans people. Were being debated about gay men in the 1980s and 90s, so we know exactly where it's rooted. Even if they don't want to say it's transphobic, it's transphobic. Actually, that's a false equivalence. It really is a very different fight, a vastly different fight, and it also is predicated on the assumption that what you think is 100% correct. You are labeling something as transphobic because you know just to say that negates any future discussion on it. Speaking as if an authority, it is an appeal to authority fallacy. Many discussions need to happen because many more problems have arisen, whether it be Tavistock, the transgender clinic NHS that had to shut down. Why? Because more and more people that had gone through that as a teenager and had transitioned because they were pushed into it, regretted it and came back. Because lawsuits are mounting because people do not understand this. How many more times do we have to say, a child's mind should not be making an adult decision? That's one of the many problems currently faced by the trans community, by the way. There are more. These things have to be discussed, and it has to be done publicly. Why? Not to villainize you, not to invalidate your experiences or you as a person, but so that the viewer, the casual person, can understand. If people do not understand, fear is allowed to root in and grow, as does any form of discrimination. The only way they can learn is through education. These debates help that. If it shines a spotlight on you and you don't like it while you unironically have a light shone on you while you give an interview talking about how you don't like a light shone on your community, it speaks more volumes about how much of an arrogant prick you are and less about the discussion itself. I'm going to continue the quote though. It's really difficult a lot of the time, but we are making huge strides. And the media has a massive impact on the general consensus within society. Like we saw with gay men and how television program had a big impact on people understanding that community from Sex and the City to Will and Grace and just having that element of laughter. That's a very good point actually, but there's one or two errors here. Firstly, media, depending on the medium, can and cannot be helpful. For example, journalism integrity is at an all-time low. No one is going to believe or listen to what they say or consider it remotely respectful. And you are right about huge strides. Those strides take time. A lot of people expect results with a click of the finger, akin to Thanos snapping the gauntlet. But that's not how this works. Now, the rest of the article is of no interest because you talk about representation in media. There are many different arguments about what's going on currently on television programming. I don't care about any of that. I don't watch TV. If you're being represented, congratulations, I guess. Sure. F's given, 0 from me. Mostly because I digest most of my content now on YouTube, and I watch many different types of people. At no point did their gender, race, sexuality, or politics determine whether or not I would digest what they produce. Is that not how we'd want a society to be? Or is that too bigoted?